Today on YouTube, Advanced Shader Graph tutorial for complete beginners. Learn how to create entirely procedural, totally dynamic, wholesomely spaghetti, stylized moving clouds, complete with depth fading, fresnel lighting and horizon bending. Like a boss! But first, if you're like me and formal education haven't entirely killed off the scholar in you, let me introduce you to... Although, what are the chances you haven't already heard about? Skillshare is an online learning community with just south of 30,000 classes on just about everything. Being a solo designer developer means you have to constantly change hats and learn new things. Thankfully, Skillshare got you covered, because you don't pay for any single course, you get access to every course. And an annual subscription of less than $10 a month means... There's just no other way of saying this. It's the Netflix of self-betterment, okay? Because Skillshare is metal and decided to sponsor my video, you can sign up with the link in the description below and get a 2-month free trial. Make your future self proud of this moment. That's 2 months of a better you on me and Skillshare just by clicking the link below. And now back to our regular programming.
Hello, Wildcat.
This is the first in a series of tutorials which will focus on new and less covered Unity topics. Don't forget to succumb to the fear of missing out and subscribe for more game dev stuff in the future. You can basically treat this video like a wider introduction to the new HDRP pipeline, because we'll not only work with the shader graph but tackle post-processing, scene setup and all that good stuff. Without further ado, let's begin. But before we jump straight into Unity, we will need a base mesh for our clouds to work with. This will take a couple of minutes and we'll utilize Blender for all our 3D needs. I will assume you never heard of Blender, so I'll guide you through every step. Go to blender.org, click download, click try Blender 2.8 beta, yeah, that's how we roll. Download for your OS of choice. But remember, we don't judge each other's OS choices here. So, you have your copy of Blender opened? Good, let's start with a little preparation first. Default Blender scene comes with a few basic objects, so we'll get rid of them by pressing A on your keyboard to select all and then X to delete. Nice. Now let's create a new shape by pressing Shift A to add mesh cylinder to our scene. Be sure not to click anywhere in the scene right now, otherwise you won't be able to modify the base parameters. Expand the window in the lower left corner and make it a 6-sided cylinder without any depth. That will give us a simple 6-sided polygon. Now press Tab to enter edit mode, and by default every vertex will be already selected for you. That means we could just press I to inset the shape by moving our mouse on the screen. Doesn't really matter by how much we inset it, because we'll collapse it by pressing Alt M and selecting at center. This is now our base triangulated 6-sided polygon. Select our mesh again by pressing A and press F3 to open command search. Enter subdivide and select mesh subdivide. We have just successfully quadrupled our polygon count, but that's just the start. With both Shift and Alt keys pressed down, click between any of the 2 vertices lying on the border of our shape. That will select the whole border. Press F3 once again and search for the command to sphere under the transform. Now move your mouse until the border becomes round. Great job! Now repeat this process one more time. Select all by pressing A, subdivide the shape and then round out the border. This should be round enough for our needs. You'll see later why this step mattered. Right now shader graph doesn't have any tessellation options, so we'll be pre-subdividing that shape ourselves. But in the future though, with built-in tessellation, we will be needing a more basic mesh, much similar to this one here now. Okay, select everything and subdivide once again, but this time we'll raise the number of cuts to 15, giving us a total of almost 25k polygons, and the random Star of David-like topology, for you conspiracy nuts out there to enjoy. 25k is cool and all, but let's subdivide it one more time, bringing our polygon count to near 100k. And basically, we're done with modeling. You can also, purely optionally, rename the mesh to your liking. Okay, now let's get the scale right. Remember, we're still in edit mode, so press Tab to get back to object mode. Press N to bring out the sidebar, and under item, with our object selected, you'll see its dimensions. Now, that's not nearly enough for, sky, so let's make it 2 kilometers in diameter. If you would try to zoom out, you would see your mesh clipping. That's because by default Blender clips the viewport at 1 km only. so bringing that number up will show everything. Last crucial step is to reset the scaling of our object, cause it's way off as a result of our previous manipulations. Go to Object, Apply, and click Scale. Congratulations, Blender apprentices, we're finished! All's left is to export our mesh for Unity. Go for the usual File Export and select FBX. Pick a location, name the bastard, and be sure to set Apply Scalings to FBX All and to Apply Transforms. Otherwise our mesh would be rotated by 90 degrees, and that's just not how we roll. Some experienced people might wonder, Roman, why haven't we just used the subdivision surface modifier? Well, the reason is that this modifier subdivides polygons in a different way, where it tries to produce quads, which gives us different, less even topology, where some parts of mesh are more dense than others, and that's just not our style.
Unity time!
Let's create a new project. I am using the latest stable Unity build at the moment, and I will be working in high definition render pipeline. Now, I don't see any reason why this shader would not work under lightweight render pipeline, save for maybe some transparency issues. So you're free to pick the one you choose. Just remember to use the proper master graph node. After waiting for the project to finish setting up, we continue forth. Now, as pretty as sample scene is, let's create a new one, and make sure we have all the components needed. Go to Window, Package Manager, and make sure all packages are shown. Scroll down and install Shader Graph. I'll be using version 5.7.2. Now let's create a couple of folders to hold our shaders and models, cleverly named shaders and models. We'll import previously created mesh and put it inside our scene. Yep, that's the one. Next, create an unlit HDRP graph shader and name it at least somewhat coherently. By clicking the shader with our right mouse button, we will create a material with that said shader already assigned to it. Last thing is to create a folder to hold our materials. Just trying to be tidy is all. Assign the material to our mesh and we're all set. With our shader selected, let's finally open the shader editor. Now, if you're like me, you might experience quite a lag inside the shader graph window. As you can see, I'm now moving the canvas with my middle mouse, and it's far too unresponsive. But moving the shader graph window off the main Unity window, say to another monitor or a virtual display, will fix that in a heartbeat. The lag you still see, and truth be told, will be seeing till the end of this video, is in fact because I'm an idiot, and I recorded this whole process in a full 5K resolution on my iMac. Bad idea. This is totally on me, and I'll do better next time. Now, there are many ways to skin a cat, and a bunch more to generate the clouds. The idea is not to use any image maps, so let's see what options do we have. There is of course the holy grail of water modeling, Gerstner wave function. Maybe we could just take that, modify it a little— oh god, please no! Okay, I remember there was an official Unity water shader example using overlaid sine waves. Come on! Is it so much to ask for something that looks good and is simple in its implementation? Well, there is. We'll base our clouds entirely on simple noise functions and still maintain quite a degree of flexibility. Okay, back to shader graph. A moment for the history books, our first node. Right-click anywhere and select Create Node. Go for the gradient noise and output it into the color input of our master node. Save our shader to apply changes, and— what the hell? Alrighty then. Seems like UV mapping is not the way to go. Let's use world space projection instead. To do that, we'll make a cute little centipede out of our nodes. Add tiling and offset node into UV input of our gradient noise node, and plug in the position node into the UV input of that one. Save the asset and let's well, at least it's different. Okay, what's happening here is that we're projecting the noise map sideways, giving us a one-dimensional noise pattern, and that is easily fixed. All we need to do is just to rotate our position by 90 degrees. So, let's branch the position node into rotate about axis node. We'll use vector 4 for both remaining input parameters. X, Y, Z of that node will be used to define our axis of rotation, and W output will be our rotation amount. We will get that via the split node. Be sure to change the units to degrees. Now we can connect that node back into our network and set default parameters, so our preview would be useful to us visually again. Convert the vector 4 node into property and rename it to rotate projection. We're all set. Save the asset and let's get back to Unity. Inside the material inspector we can see our fresh properties. X set to 1 means we'll be rotating our projection along the x-axis by the number of degrees we enter inside the W parameter. And as you may see, as we raise the degree of rotation, our projection is straightening out. But it's hard to make out the noise on such a big scale. Remember, our mesh is 2 km in diameter, so let's change the scale of our gradient noise to 0.1. Much better now. Now, I don't like that our noise preview became pretty much a useless grey rectangle, because of the scale we're working on. So what we'll do is create a property with the default parameter just for the shader graph, but change the value in the inspector to our needs. For consistency's sake, let's call it noise scale. Now we have full control of the noise node from inside our scene. Dope! Before we move on to more shader graph fun stuff, let's do a little organizing. Collapse the nodes you just created, put them in a group and set them aside for now. There's still more to noise pattern, but let's jump ahead a little and animate the bastard. It's always more fun when things are moving. So, create the time node and connect the first output to offset slot of our tiling and offset node. Things are moving. But you know what? They're moving much too fast for my taste. So let's plug our time node inside the multiply node first. That will allow us to control the speed at which our clouds would be moving. Multiply it by 0.1 and don't forget to save the asset. Once back in Unity, we must make sure that the animated materials under viewport effects toggle settings are turned on. Seems like our clouds are so slow now we can't even notice the movement inside the viewport. Go back to shader graph and create a vector 1 node to control the speed. Let's set it to a random 110 and see what'll happen. Now we're talking. Like previously, let's define a default, much smaller speed, so that our shader graph preview isn't freaking out, but we will set the real amount inside the material inspector. So follow along, convert the node to property and name it respectively. From here we can play with different speed amounts and make sure everything works as intended. I'm gonna go ahead and hide the grid from our viewport, keeping the minimalistic lifestyle thing going. After we'd admired our black and white mess of a so-called cloud, let's get back to shader graph. We're gonna put our heavily subdivided mesh we worked on so hard in Blender to good use. First, we need to create a position node, which will give us precisely that for each of our thousands of vertices. Next, a normal vector node, which will give us the normals of those vertices. Set the space drop-down to object. And now we will multiply the normals by the amount of our gradient noise. That will give us a cool 0 to 1 value along which the vertices will be displaced, although that's not nearly enough for the scale at which we are working. Set the space parameter of our position node to object as well, put them side by side and combine the results using the add node. Finally, connect the output into position of our master node. Now, as I previously said, the output of gradient noise is between 0 and 1, and with such values on our scale of kilometers we just won't notice a thing, so we'll create a multiply node and the property to control the amount of displacement, which is basically how high will our clouds go. Right now I will just set it to 1 to show the difference in the viewport. Don't forget to save the asset and let's look at the result. As suspected, looks like nothing's changed. But we know that looks can be deceiving, so maybe from a side angle we might see something. Nah, let's just crank that multiply amount. Set it to 100, save the asset, and boom! Now we're talking. Our game view, though, wasn't prepared to see this black magic. Let's bring the camera a little higher, just a sliver above the clouds. Okay, all's left is to make a property out of our vector1 node and name it respectively. Save the asset and you're free to go crazy with the values inside of Unity. Before moving forward, let's quickly organize our nodes by grouping all the ones responsible for displacing our mesh. And let's close the main preview window, as it's no longer of use to us. Right now our clouds are moving, but despite that, the pattern itself is still static, which is boring, so let's fix that. Duplicate the gradient noise node and connect the same noise scale property to it. For UV input, create a new tiling and offset node, and plug in the same projection group output into it. What we have now is basically the same noise pattern at the same scale, but without any movement. Now we're gonna combine those maps using the add node and then divide the result by 2, effectively normalizing it, meaning our output will be between 0 and 1 instead of a combined 2, which is crucial to our further calculations. Connect the output from the divide node back into our network. Now here's something to note. Sometimes shader graph won't let you connect a new node to the one that is being utilized at the moment. So first you'll have to disconnect the output of that node, make our new connection and then reconnect the output back. Okay, we're ready to save the asset and take a look at the result. Now ain't this much better? The pattern comes alive and it's almost completely random and unpredictable, and that is exactly what we're aiming for. But right now our clouds have a very smooth sine wave-like shape, and that's not the look we're going for. What we need for them is to look more like this, with round peaks and sharp valleys. So that is exactly what we're going to do next with some math wizardry. First we need to modify our output by using the remap node. What it does is just that, it remaps values from one range to another. So right now our output is a value from 0 to 1, and we need to expand it to go from -1 to 1, which will place 0 in this range exactly in the middle. Now we just absolute that output, converting every negative value into positive, which gives 0 to 1 range again, but the pattern now is much more complex. Reconnect the node back into our graph. Side note, you may need to fiddle with the connections here like me again. Don't forget to save and let's switch back to Unity. Ain't that something? I love how we're starting to get these non-uniform shapes. Although black and white grading is getting a bit old, but we're gonna fix that pretty soon. Let me just slow this down a bit. Yes, I'm really happy with the results so far, and we're using just a few nodes here and there. Let's make a property out of the remap node, so we can modify it in real time, giving us the flexibility to change the general look of our clouds. Let's make a property out of our remap node, so we can modify it in real time, giving us the flexibility to change the general look of our clouds. Now, we can't convert the remap node itself to a property, but what we can do is make a vector4 node and split its output into a couple of different vector2s, using the combine node, just like that. Now we make that vector4 a property, and let's get back to Unity and play with the parameters. As you can see, by modifying the remap values, we can get pretty different results. Right now though, I won't worry too much about the look. We'll tune it later, after adding some more stuff on top. And we'll start by controlling the color of our clouds. Now, this step is pretty simple, it's just a matter of interpolating our noise map between two colors. Add a lerp node and connect our output into the interpolant input, marked as T. Next, create two color nodes and connect them into A and B slots. For default values, just set them to black and white, corresponding with our peaks and valleys. Convert them to properties and name accordingly. Don't forget to connect the output of lerp node back into color slot of our master node. Let's group these nodes and save the asset. I'm gonna give my clouds a grayish blue color, but you're free to go crazy with yours. Next, let's add an ability to control the slope of our clouds, giving us just a bit more flexibility overall. Let's move these nodes to the side and connect the smooth step node right in the middle. You could already see the result of that node in the preview. What it does is, it smoothes out the peaks and valleys of our height map. Save the asset and take a look at the change. As you can see, our clouds have quite a different look to them now. Let's plug in a couple of Vector1 nodes in place of default smooth step parameters, and make them properties for us to play inside the inspector to find the shape that's right for us. Finally, let's add one more node to our graph to control the fluffiness of the clouds. We'll do that by plugging in the power node right before our remap node. And to save us some back and forth, let's go ahead and make a property for the number of times we are raising our input by. In math, this operation is called exponentiation, and here it's just power, because shaders are metal. Do the usual, name the property, save the asset, and let's check the result. As you can see, now we have the control over how much do the peaks dominate over the valleys, I guess. But also notice we have some weird artifacts on our mesh. Fortunately for us, this is easily fixed. Back in shader graph, we can see the same thing, pink dots appearing in some parts of our map. The fix is to prepend our power node with saturate node. What it does is making sure that every value that is lower than 0 stays as 0, and every value over 1 stays as 1. This is the equivalent of clamp 0 to 1 in coding. Seeing now that the artifacts are gone leads us to believe that the input wasn't in fact between 0 and 1, and I guess power node just doesn't like that. Our shader network is quickly maturing, so let's group some of the nodes together, name them accordingly, and collapse the properties. See you on the other side. Now remember, our sky disk is 2 km in diameter, so I think lowering the size of our noise pattern would suit the scale more. But I hate the overall uniformity we still have. It won't be that noticeable if at all from our game view, but it bugs me all the same. So let's quickly fix that. Can you guess how are we gonna do that? Correct, in case of emergency, use the noise node. Okay. The idea here is to create a larger base layer that would be mixed in with our current noise layer and introduce the much needed variation. The first part is basically all the same steps from before. We create a gradient noise node, create a property to control the scale, name it, realize your mistake and name it the right way. Next, plug in the tiling and offset node. Find our projection group and connect its output into the UV slot. Plug in the multiply node inside the offset input and connect our time node. Realize that some nodes now have to leave the time group and move them around to untangle the mess you have created. Now create a property to control the speed of our new noise node. Move some other nodes around. And we're ready. Okay, it's time to combine the layers. Create the add node and connect the output of our noise modification network with our noise node. Plug it in all the same places our previous output was connected to. And in the scene view, we can now change the base scale property to see that we are in fact combining our noise maps of different scales, although the effect is almost negligible. So let's multiply that sucker to make it more prominent. Go back to our graph and do nothing of the extraordinary sorts. Just the same good old multiply node and the property to control the strength. Reconnect it back into our graph and save the asset. Much better. But what we've done here is just overlaid the two noises. The heart's in right place, but that's not what we wanted. The idea was to eat in the other noise, so let's finish it. Connect the divide node to the output of our add node and create a separate add node to divide our result by. Enter 1 into the first parameter of that node and connect the base noise strength property to the second parameter. What we're doing is getting the combined range of both noises and using it to bring our result back to 0 to 1 range. Reconnect it back into our network, save the asset and let's switch back to Unity. Now, by raising the base strength, we specify how much of our main noise layer gets mixed in with the lighter parts of our base noise, while in dark parts the details remain more defined. And by raising the noise height, we control the overall vertical scale. This was the final step needed to get the most of our pretty simple and straightforward cloud setup. I'm gonna play now with all the parameters until I find the shape that suits my taste the most, and you should too. Inside the shader graph, I encourage you to group the nodes together and take the time to organize your space. In the end, I decided upon these parameters for my clouds, further scaling everything down. Now, let's take a look through our game view. Our camera is just above the clouds, but no matter how we look or how high we'll place the clouds, we'll still see the horizon, which just looks bad and wrong. So let's fix that with some more shader magic. But first, I just hate how dull the color of our clouds is, and that's because real clouds are lit by the light, and ours just bleh. So let's create a multiply node out of our colorize group and append a property to control the strength of said operation. We will use this node group to set the amount of emission our shader will emit. So name everything properly and connect the result to the emission slot of our master node. Save the asset and let's take a look at the result. And seems like nothing's changed. We can turn the emission value up or down, but our clouds are still as dull as they were. What's happening here? Well, that's because by default, every HDRP scene will have render settings and post-processing settings assets included and enabled, which gives us this cool HDRP look. But what it also does is limiting the exposure of our scene. So let's bring some numbers down. And while we're at it, let's turn down the directional light, because it's lighting up the volumetric fog and blinds our camera, which is also enabled in our scene by default. You know what, let's turn the light completely off for the time being. Now, if we'll return to our material, we would see that emission parameter is now working as it should. And this is now starting to look much better. And we can return to fixing that horizon problem. Remember earlier in Blender I said that we need a round shape for a reason? This should be round enough for our needs. You'll see later why this step mattered. Well, this is the place where it finally comes into play, because we're gonna bend our sky like a bowl, and you can't have a nice rim if your shape has sharp corners. So, to do that, once again, we will need the help from our math gods. Add the following nodes to your shader graph canvas: normal vector, position, object, distance. Object is a new node for us, but it's self-explanatory. It gives us basic information about our object, like position and scale. We are going to use it to find the distance between the center of our object, its position, and each of the vertices denoted by the position node. No need to change the world space of our position node, because the object node by default gives us world space values. Okay, now let's multiply the result of our distance node with the normal vector, just how we've done it in the past. All's left is to combine our offsets using the add node and plug the result back into our master node. Save the asset and voila! Ground control, we have a cone! Great, now that we know our nodes are doing exactly what we needed from them, let's turn that cone into a ball. At the moment we are offsetting our vertices linearly, based on the distance from the object center, giving us a precise 45-degree angle. What we need though is to interpolate those values. So, go and add a power node, just right after the distance node. Reconnect it into our network and make it cubic by entering number 3 into the other slot. I don't recommend you switching back to Unity, just well, now you've done it. Okay, power node doesn't joke around. We're just dealing with very big values, so let's bring them down. Divide the distance node and create a property for the division by parameter. Name it curvature radius and now switch back to Unity. Now, prepare to have your mind blown. By raising the curvature radius parameter, we are able to control how much does our clouds bend to horizon, allowing us to create a feeling of an endless sky. And be sure to check out how it looks from the game screen. Let's group our nodes and take a look at our network from distance. Looks alright, only a couple more steps to getting perfect clouds. But before we move on, I'd ultimately like to fix a couple of things in our scene lighting. First of all, let's switch back on the directional light and then go to render settings and disable the volumetric fog. We don't have the need for fancy stuff at this moment, but you're free to do whatever you want once we'll finish this up. Okay, the thing that bugs me is that the sky gets brighter closer to the horizon, but our clouds remain just meh. So let's throw a simple fresnel into the mix. We won't be doing anything crazy, because of the nature of the clouds, them being very forgiving when it comes to light scattering. For those who are unfamiliar with what the hell is fresnel, well, basically, when it comes to shaders, Fresnel effect gives us the angle between the surface of our mesh and the line of sight, which is also called the angle of incidence. You can see the effect right on the node itself. As we move our eyes from the center of previous sphere towards the edges, the angle changes and we get a nice gradient. Same thing happens with our clouds. The farther they go, the sharper the angle of incidence becomes. Okay, so let's rewind and go step by step again. Branch our combined noise group output into a multiply node. In our case, it will act as an alpha map for our Fresnel, meaning we'll get less of the effect in the valleys. Plug in the Fresnel effect into the other slot of the multiply node, and create a property to control the power of the Fresnel. The higher the value, the sharper the effect will be. Now let's create an opacity controller by outputting the result into another multiply node and creating another property. All's left is to combine our effect with the colorized group output using the add node and plug it all back into our network of nodes, both the color slot of our master node and the emission group. As usual, don't forget to save the asset and let's switch back to Unity. The effect could be seen at once. Let's tweak the parameters to our taste. Now this is much better. Before moving to the final part of our clouds, I'm just gonna take a second to organize the nodes. You're welcome to do the same. Now, this is the big one. We're going to tackle the transparency. First of all, let's create a huge box to act as our intersecting geometry. I'm just gonna move it into the camera view and rotate it for no reason. The lighting is a bit harsh at the moment, so let's bring down the intensity of our directional light. Next, I'm gonna apply a simple white material I've created behind the scenes to our cube. It's not necessary, I just wanted something controllable in case. Go to Render Settings Asset, disable the volumetric fog, if you're like me and left it enabled between the different takes. Find the Visual Environment section and enable Ambient Mode, setting it to Dynamic. Great, our scene now looks much better. Now we are ready to tackle the transparency. Okay, so we're gonna use some new nodes now. Create the Scene Depth node and set the sampling mode to I. Next, add the Screen Position node and set its mode to Raw. These nodes give us the screen position of our mesh vertices and the camera's depth buffer. We can leverage that information to add transparency where our clouds intersect with other geometry. Now, split the Screen Position node into channels and subtract one from the alpha channel. Create another subtract node and plug in the outputs of our nodes. Disclaimer time. I'd love to speculate on what the hell are we even doing here, but I'm pretty sure there are much smarter people that can do a better job of explaining what's happening here, without sounding stupid while trying to pronounce phrases like homogeneous coordinates and projective vector space. For now though, remember that's how we get the depth information to use in scenarios like this one. Okay, we can already try to connect the result of our calculations into the alpha channel of our master node. Next step is a crucial one. We have to enable the transparency on our shader. Click the small gear icon on the master node and select Transparent from the surface type dropdown. Also, let's check the double-sided parameter, just for the hell of it. Now, don't yet switch back to Unity, cause you'll either see all white or no changes at all. The reason is that we're simply still working on a much grander scale than usual. So what we need to do is to divide the result of our calculations. Enter some large number like 100 and make a property of it. This will be our setting for controlling the density of our clouds, or in other words, the range of transparency. One final step is to saturate our result. That was the reason for the whiteout. We don't like our alpha values going overboard. Okay, this might surprise you, but we're done. Switch back to Unity and see for yourself. Ah, so pretty. And by changing the value of the fade depth parameter we just added, we are able to control the density of our clouds. But wait, Roman, what are those? If you pay close attention, you might notice that since we enabled transparency, some polygons on our mesh randomly decided to creep out of existence. Well, that's surely a deal breaker for us. But it's not all lost yet. Now, at this moment in time, Shader Graph doesn't have any options for us to fix this, so we're just gonna have to put our hacking gloves on and hack away at some code ourselves. Don't worry though, it's far more easier than it sounds. Switch back to Shader Graph and first of all, let's group the nodes. Zoom out and admire the work you have put in today. There's nothing wrong in feeling proud of yourself. Okay, back to the issue. Right-click the master node and select Show Generated Code. You will be switched to your code editor of choice, Visual Studio Code in my case. First of all, let's save the shader back into our shaders folder. Find your project and call it something like Clouds Generated. Switch back to Unity and switch out our Shader Graph shader with the newly generated one. Notice that the name of our shader is not the same as the name of the file, as it has taken the name of our master node, Unlit Master. That name can be easily changed inside the generated code, right at the very top. Okay, once switched, everything should look the same. Let's go back to our code editor. Scroll down or use the search command to find the path named forward only. All we have to do is set the Z-Write parameter to on instead of the default off. Save the shader and switch back to Unity. Ta-da! No more clipping artifacts. You are now officially a licensed airbender. Okay, one final trick you can do. Append a smooth tap node to the end of the depth fade group and leave the default parameters as they are. Reconnect it back into the alpha channel and switch back to Unity. Now, there is nothing wrong with the linear transparency falloff we have here now with our generated shader. But if you'll switch it back to shader graph version, just by dragging the shader onto the material, you'll notice the falloff becoming just slightly smoother thanks to the smooth step node. With all you've seen here, it's easy to imagine how this all could be applied to create oceans and rivers, desert dunes and alien landscapes. So what are you waiting for? Go out there, be bold, be creative. The world is your oyster. I really hope you enjoyed my first tutorial and learned something along the way. As you might or may not know, I'm developing my first major title, an atmospheric golf-inspired narrative-driven game, and it's been a couple of months since my last devlog. Well, blame it on my obsession with new and shiny. I just had to try Unity's new scriptable render pipelines and the tools that come with it. Who knew I'd find shader graph to be a very capable tool already and a joy to use. So I guess I'm staying. Making 40-minute videos is a monumental challenge and takes weeks to produce, so I really count on you guys to spread the love. Leave a comment, share the video, like the video, consider buying me a cup of coffee or supporting me on Patreon. Speaking of Patreon, thank you so much, my dudes. I won't be butchering your names this time with my terrible accent, but I want you to leave this video knowing that you're making a big difference in one particular wannabe game developer's life. And because you guys are so awesome, I'll be uploading the whole Unity project with the shader and the mesh for any Patreon tier to download and dissect. So if someone's ever needed an excuse to support a struggling Unity dev, now's your chance.